Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're opening a file that sits right on this really uncomfortable fault line between science, skepticism, and faith. We're unpacking the investigation of Lee Strobel.
Right, and you might know the name. He's a massive best-selling author now. But the sources we're looking at today take us back to, well, way before the fame, back to when he was a legal editor for the Chicago Tribune.
Yeah, and that legal editor title, that is really the lens you have to view this entire deep dive through. We aren't talking about a guy who was looking for a spiritual experience or some, warm, fuzzy feeling.
Exactly. We are talking about a professional skeptic here, a hard-nosed journalist who dealt in admissible evidence. If you couldn't prove it in a courtroom, Strobel simply wasn't interested.
The sources paint a picture of a guy who was frankly hostile to anything he couldn't touch or dissect. And there's actually this anecdote from his childhood that I think perfectly frames his psychology. So he gets an electric train for Christmas. Now, most kids, they set up the track, they maybe build a little paper village, they watch it go in circles.
Right, you play conductor, you just enjoy the illusion of it.
Not Lee.
Yeah.
His dad walks into the garage a few hours later and finds Lee smashing the locomotive against the concrete floor, just absolutely destroying it. His dad is horrified, obviously, and asks what on earth he's doing. And Lee looks up, totally calm, and says, "I'm trying to figure out how it works."
Which is the ultimate why personality in a nutshell. He didn't want the magic, he wanted the mechanics. And that drive to dismantle things, to strip away the casing and see the gears, is exactly what he applied to the concept of God. But the irony is, for the first half of his life, he was using that drive to completely dismantle religion.
Specifically Christianity. He viewed it as a crutch for people who just couldn't handle the harsh reality of the universe. And the sources point to a very specific moment where this worldview kind of locked into place for him. It's 1966. He's a freshman in high school, sitting in a third-floor biology class.
This is the massive pivot point. The teacher explains the Miller-Urey experiment from 1953. This was a huge deal in the scientific community at the time. Stanley Miller had essentially recreated the early Earth's atmosphere in a lab setup. We're talking flasks, tubes, gases like methane and ammonia. And he shot electricity through it to simulate lightning.
I remember seeing pictures of this in my own textbooks, actually. The little glass trap at the bottom catching that red sludge.
Yes, exactly. And the result of that sludge was amino acids, the fundamental building blocks of life.
And for a young Lee Strobel, the logic was instant and, frankly, devastating to any religious notion he had. He thought, well, if the origin of life can be explained purely through chemistry, if you can make life in a test tube with just gas and sparks, then God is out of a job.
It's a very clean argument. If nature does the heavy lifting, you don't need a supernatural creator. So he becomes a confirmed atheist. Fast forward a bit, he marries his wife, Leslie, who is also an atheist. They're living the high life. His career at the Tribune is taking off. He feels like he has the whole world figured out. But then the data changes.
The data being his wife.
Right.
In 1972, Leslie announces she's become a Christian. And Strobel panics. He literally thinks to himself, okay, this is the end of our marriage. He's expecting her to turn into this judgmental, boring prude who ruins his Sunday mornings. But the sources say he saw the exact opposite.
Yeah, he saw incredibly positive changes. Her character, her patience, the way she parented, the way she treated him, it all improved.
And that creates a major cognitive dissonance for him. He's thinking, I know God is a fairy tale, I know the science proves it, but I can't deny the reality of the change in my wife. So, true to his nature, true to that kid smashing the train in the garage, he launches an investigation. He decides he's going to take his legal skills and put the evidence for God on trial.
But he doesn't start with theology.
No, he goes right back to science.
He goes back to the pillars that made him an atheist in the first place. He calls them the icons of evolution. He wanted to see if the science he learned in that 1966 classroom, the stuff that proved God was unnecessary, could actually stand up to cross-examination decades later.
So let's walk through this investigation with him, because what he finds is honestly pretty shocking. He starts exactly where his atheism started. The origin of life, that famous Miller-Urey experiment.
Right. And to get to the bottom of this, Strobel interviews Jonathan Wells. Now, Wells is an interesting figure. He holds a PhD in molecular and cell biology from Berkeley, and he tells Strobel that the Miller experiment, the one still featured in textbooks today, is scientifically invalid.
Wait, hold on. Invalid.
Yeah.
They created amino acids. That's a recorded historical fact.
They did create amino acids, you're totally right. But the premise was flawed. Miller basically stacked the deck. He based the experiment on a reducing atmosphere, which is rich in hydrogen, methane, and ammonia. That's the only way the chemical reaction works to produce those building blocks.
Okay, but why is that a problem?
Because geochemists today largely agree that the actual early Earth didn't look anything like that. It wasn't hydrogen-rich. It was likely a volcanic atmosphere, mostly water vapor, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen.
Oh, so he used the wrong ingredients entirely.
Exactly.
But surely, if you run the spark through the correct atmosphere, the volcanic one, you still get something, right?
You get something, all right, but you don't get amino acids. If you run that experiment with the scientifically accurate atmosphere, the sparks don't create life blocks. They create toxic chemicals, specifically formaldehyde and cyanide.
Yikes. So instead of the primordial soup of life, you get...
Embalming fluid. Wells literally calls it embalming fluid. It's a mixture that kills life, it doesn't start it. So the experiment that convinced Strobel that God was out of a job was based on a fantasy scenario.
That is a massive blow to the foundation. But I want to push back a little here, just like Strobel did during his investigation. Let's play devil's advocate. Let's say, theoretically, a different experiment did produce the amino acids. You have the parts. Couldn't they just sort of assemble? Give it enough time? Like if you have enough Legos and you shake the box long enough, eventually you get a castle.
That is the million-dollar question right there. And this is where the investigation shifts from chemistry to probability. Wells uses the Humpty Dumpty analogy here, and it's brilliant because it visualizes the sheer complexity we are dealing with.
Lay it out for us.
Imagine you take a sterile test tube and you put a single living cell inside it, just one. Then you take a microscopic needle and you poke a hole in that cell. All the contents leak out into the tube.
Okay, so now you have a test tube filled with absolutely everything required for life. Every molecule, every enzyme, every single strand of DNA. It's not just random chemicals anymore, it's the perfect recipe.
Exactly. There are no missing ingredients. It is chemically perfect. But the question is, can you make it alive again?
No, it's just a soup of complex parts at that point.
Right. You cannot put Humpty Dumpty back together. Wells is making the point that the gap between non-living chemicals and a living, self-replicating organism is an insurmountable cliff. A living cell isn't just a bag of chemicals, it's a factory. It has molecular motors, information storage systems, energy turbines.
He even quotes Francis Crick in the source material, the guy who co-discovered DNA, a staunch secularist, who admitted that the origin of life appears to be almost a miracle.
Almost a miracle. That is incredibly strong language coming from a secular scientist. So Strobel realizes that the simple jump from chemicals to life that he believed in as a teenager is actually a scientific impossibility based on what we know today.
So Strobel crosses origin of life off his list of atheist defenses. But evolution isn't just about the start, is it? It's about the process. So he moves to the next big icon on his list, the tree of life.
This is the classic image. It's actually the only illustration Darwin included in The Origin of Species. It shows a single ancient ancestor at the bottom, like a trunk, and then it branches out gradually over millions of years into all the complex animals we see today.
It implies slow, steady change. Simple to complex. I think we've all seen that chart.
We have. But Strobel finds out that the fossil record, the actual hard evidence from the ground, tells a completely different story. He dives into the Cambrian explosion.
The biological Big Bang.
Yes. And to understand the scale of this, Wells gives Strobel a visualization that really helps. I want you to imagine the history of life on Earth is a football field.
Okay, I'm standing on the goal line. That's the very beginning of life.
Right. And you start walking. You pass the 10-yard line, the 20, midfield, and all you see are single-celled organisms, bacteria, algae, nothing complex at all. You keep walking, you pass the opponent's 40, the 20, still just single cells.
That is a very long, very boring walk. I'm almost at the other end zone now.
It is. You get all the way to the 16-yard line on the other end of the field, and then suddenly, in the space of a single stride, boom! Almost every major animal phylum appears.
In a single stride.
A single stride, fully formed. We're talking arthropods, chordates, echinoderms, spikes, eyes, hard shells, spinal cords. They just appear. There are absolutely no gradual branches leading up to them.
Well, that doesn't look like a tree at all.
No. Paleontologists today, even the ones who aren't religious, don't call it a tree anymore. They call it a lawn.
A lawn.
Think about it. A tree has one trunk that branches. A lawn has separate blades of grass sprouting up independently from the dirt. The fossil record shows these major animal groups appearing separately, like blades of grass, without the connecting branches Darwin predicted.
That flips the script entirely.
Yeah.
Because if the branches aren't there, then the missing links aren't just missing because we haven't found them yet. They're missing because they never existed.
It's a silence in the rock that screams, Darwin himself said that if his theory was true, the Earth should be swarming with transitional forms. But the Cambrian explosion says the exact opposite.
All right, so the chemistry fails, the fossil record fails.
Hmm.
But I remember my high school biology book, and there was one thing that seemed undeniably convincing. The embryos.
Ah, yes. Ernst Haeckel's drawings.
These are the sketches that show a human embryo, a chicken, a fish, and a salamander. And in the early stages, they look virtually identical. The lesson was always, look, we all share a common ancestor because we all start out exactly the same.
This part of the investigation is probably the most scandalous, because Wells reveals to Strobel that these drawings were not just simplified for students, they were faked.
Faked is a strong word. You don't mean just artistic interpretation.
I mean flat-out fraud. Haeckel doctored the images. He actually took the same woodcut and printed it multiple times to represent completely different species. He omitted the earliest stages of development where the embryos look vastly different. He only showed the middle stage, and even then, he distorted them to make them look more alike.
Wait, so if you look at the actual earliest stage, before the drawings show, they don't look alike?
No, it's called the developmental hourglass. Embryos start out very different, then they converge and look somewhat similar in the middle, and then they diverge again. Haeckel just cut out the top of the hourglass to make his point.
That feels incredibly dishonest.
It was. His own colleagues accused him of fraud in the 1860s.
The 1860s. But I saw these in a textbook in the 90s. How does a known fraud survive for over 100 years in science classrooms?
That's the question that really rattled Strobel. Wells calls it materialistic philosophy masquerading as science. It's an icon that is too good to give up, even if it's false. It's visually persuasive, even if it's a lie.
What about the gill slits? That was the other big one. The idea that humans have gills in the womb till we came from fish.
Strobel dug into that too. They aren't gills. They are skin folds that eventually develop into parts of the jaw, neck, and ear canal. They never function as breathing apparatuses. Calling them gills is just reading evolutionary theory back into the evidence. It's pure confirmation bias.
Okay, let's talk about one that feels a bit more robust. Homology. This is the idea that because a bat wing and a human hand have similar bone structures, they must have a common ancestor.
This is tricky because similarity can imply common ancestry. It's a logical inference. But Wells points out it can also imply common design.
Common design.
Think about an engineer. If you're building a car, a truck, and a bus, you're going to use wheels, axles, and steering columns for all of them. Not because the truck evolved from the car, but because those are the best parts for the job.
Right. Wells shares a great anecdote about this in the book called Barra's Blunder.
Yes. Tim Barra was a biologist who tried to illustrate descent with modification. He showed pictures of a 1953 Corvette, then a 1954, then a 1955. He said, look, you can see the evolution.
Which on the surface sounds like a slam dunk argument.
Until you realize that Corvettes don't breed. They don't have baby Corvettes. They are designed by engineers. The similarity is evidence of an intelligent mind behind the process, not natural selection. Barra inadvertently made the case for intelligent design.
That is a brilliant point. And Strobel finds that the genetics back this up too, right? If the bone structures are the same because of a common ancestor, the genes making them should be the same.
You would think so. That would be the smoking gun. But it turns out often they aren't. Different genes can build similar structures. For example, the gene that builds a fruit fly's eye is totally different from the one that builds a mouse's eye, yet the structures have functional similarities. If they came from a common ancestor, the genetic pathway should be identical. It's just not.
So let's recap the scorecard here. The origin of life experiment. A bust. The fossil record. It's a lawn, not a tree. The embryos.
Faked.
The bone similarity. Could easily be designed. Strobel is running out of icons, but surely there's one big one left. The missing link.
Archaeopteryx.
The superstar, the half-bird, half-reptile.
It is a beautiful fossil. But Wills argues it's not a missing link at all. It's a bird. It has modern feathers, suitable for flight.
But didn't it have reptilian features? Like teeth and a tail?
It did. But here's the kicker that usually gets left out of the museum placard. The reptilian ancestors that scientists say Archaeopteryx evolved from. They appear in the fossil record tens of millions of years after Archaeopteryx.
Wait, run that back. The ancestor appears after the descendant.
Exactly. It's a time travel problem. You can't be your own grandfather. If the reptile that is supposed to be the parent appears 30 million years later, it's simply not the parent.
That seems like a pretty significant glitch in the timeline.
It is. And Strobel's investigation uncovers that The pressure to fix these glitches, this desperate need to find a link, has led to some really embarrassing moments for science.
We have to talk about the turkey.
The Bambi raptor.
This story is wild. Researchers claim they found dinosaur DNA in a bone that was 65 million years old. This was going to be the smoking gun linking dinos to birds. It was published in Science magazine, which is the absolute holy grail of publishing.
And it turned out to be 100% turkey DNA.
Turkey DNA. Inside a dinosaur bone. How does that even happen?
Contamination. Wells suggests someone probably dropped a turkey sandwich in the lab or at the dig site. But here's the thing. Because the scientific community was so hungry for evidence connecting dinosaurs to birds, they published it.
A turkey sandwich made it into Science magazine because it fit the narrative. That is terrifying.
It shows the power of the paradigm. And it's not the only time. Remember Java Man?
The ape-man face. I remember seeing that in encyclopedias growing up.
Strobel did too. It convinced him evolution was true as a kid. But it turns out Java Man consisted of a skull cap, a thigh bone found 50 feet away, and 3 teeth.
That's it.
That's it. And modern evidence suggests the thigh bone was human and the skull cap might have been a giant gibbon. They likely didn't even belong to the same creature. But an artist took those fragments, used a whole lot of imagination, and sculpted a face that looked half human, half ape. It was art, not evidence.
So Strobel finishes this entire investigation. He's looked at the chemical soup, the fossils, the embryos, the missing links, and they've all crumbled under the kind of scrutiny he used in the courtroom. Where does this leave him?
It leaves him with a conclusion that surprised even him. He realized that it takes more faith to believe in the accidental, naturalistic origin of life than it does to believe in a creator.
It's not just about debunking evolution, though, is it? It's about the alternative.
Right. It's what he calls affirmative evidence. It's not just that the old theory fails, it's that the evidence we do have actively points to intelligence.
Like the complexity of the cell.
Exactly. When you look at the molecular machines inside a cell, turbines, trucks, information storage that completely dwarfs any computer code that screams design, the Cambrian explosion, that sudden burst of creativity that points to a designer.
And he emphasizes that he's not the only one thinking this. There's this narrative that all real scientists agree on the atheistic view.
Which is false. Strobel found a list called A Scientific Descent from Darwinism. It's signed by over 600 scientists, PhDs from Yale, Stanford, Cornell.
These aren't just internet bloggers.
No, these are professors of molecular biology, chemists, physicists, and they signed a statement saying they are highly skeptical of the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. It shows that there is a legitimate scientific debate happening, even if it gets silenced in the textbooks.
So what does this all mean for you listening? For the listener who maybe grew up thinking science and God were enemies?
I think Strobel's journey invites us to completely rethink that relationship. We're often told that science buries God, that the more we know, the less we need a creator.
But Strobel is saying the exact opposite.
He is. He's suggesting that if you really follow the evidence, if you clear away the bad drawings, the flawed experiments, and the just-so stories, science might actually be the very thing that uncovers the designer.
It brings us right back to that train in the garage. The more Lee smashed it, the more he understood the mechanics. But understanding the mechanics didn't prove the train appeared by accident.
No. Understanding the mechanics proved that someone brilliant built it.
And that leaves us with a really provocative thought to walk away with. If the icons we've accepted for decades, the things we thought were settled facts, turn out to be flawed or even faked, what other settled science might actually just be materialistic philosophy masquerading as data?
That is a question definitely worth chewing on.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the investigation of Lee Strobel. Keep asking why, keep smashing those trains to see how they work, and we'll catch you next time.